In 2014, a maintenance supervisor at an Atlanta golf course brought in a mapping crew to see what was under the turf near the fifth green. The ground-penetrating radar didn't find bedrock or old drainage lines. It found dozens of human shapes packed into the soil. 86 bodies, buried about 6 feet down, all oriented the same way, all without stones, names, or paperwork. The grass was immaculate. The history underneath it wasn't. That course had been laid out in the 1930s on property once used by the county almshouse, a public institution where poverty was treated like an offense. Atlanta wasn't unique. It was a replay of something that happened, county by county, for more than a century. Land set aside for those the public didn't want to see, then repurposed when the institution closed. The dead left behind like inconvenient evidence. When you start tracing these sites, you don't just find one forgotten cemetery. You find a whole administrative culture built to make certain lives easy to misplace. From the 1820s through the mid-20th century, most American counties ran some version of a poor farm, sometimes called an almshouse, county home, or infirmary. The label shifted, but the function stayed the same. The county could send you there if you were broke, old, sick, disabled, orphaned, or simply considered a problem. You lived there under supervision. You worked there if you were able. In many records, you were not a tenant or a patient, you were an inmate. Federal enumerators often reduced people to a single blunt classification in the occupation line, pauper. There was even a special census supplement that grouped poverty and disability with delinquency, as if need itself were moral contamination. And before the poor farms, there was an even harsher system in some towns. Vendus, public auctions of human dependency. Local governments would effectively lease a person's labor to the bidder who promised to house and feed them the cheapest. Families could be split across multiple households. Children could be placed like tools. If you want to understand what a society thinks of the vulnerable, don't start with its speeches. Start with its procurement practices. The poor farm was marketed as a reform more orderly, more humane than auctions. But once you read the inspections, the newspapers, the burial ledgers, the story turns. The institutions were overcrowded. Rations were meager. Disease moved through dormitories. Staff held immense power and little oversight. And when people died, the county's solution was often speed and silence. Milwaukee County, Wisconsin, is a case study in how long silence can last. The county poor farm operated across multiple generations, and its burial register stretches from the late 19th century into the 1970s. What's been located on the landscape isn't a single potter's field but multiple separate burial grounds, 5 distinct pauper cemeteries identified over time. Newspapers complained as far back as the 1870s that the graves were so poorly maintained that coffins surfaced after weather and erosion. The complaint wasn't a warning about dignity. It was a headline about embarrassment. One account from a man who buried the dead there lingers because it refuses to let the reader look away. He describes digging for infants and adults alike, describing the dead not as cases but as people, newborns, exhausted elders, those who lived hard lives and died without anyone claiming them. His helper was an elderly resident of the infirmary assigned to keep graves pre-dug open spaces waiting for strangers who hadn't died yet. That detail is the institutional mindset in miniature. Death expected, prepared for, normalized, and anonymized. Montgomery County, Maryland pushes the story into the terrain of racial violence and inherited harm. Its county home traces back to the late 18th century, and inspections in the 19th and early 20th centuries described segregated quarters that were crowded, filthy, and vermin-infested. People slept wherever they could, including on floors. But the most chilling thread is what happens when you connect the poor farm cemetery to the county's history of lynching. Reports indicate that lynching victims, men murdered by mobs, were disposed of in unmarked graves on the poor farm grounds. The act of erasure didn't end with death. It doubled down on it. Decades later, when the property was converted for industrial use, developers found more unmarked graves, some believed to belong to people who had been enslaved by prior owners. Archaeologists tried to recover identities and could not. Additional remains were relocated during later projects. Even now, transportation plans have threatened to cut through the area, forcing agencies to ask a question that should have been answered 100 years ago. Where are all the bodies? Back in Fulton County, Georgia, the Atlanta site, the county, opened 2 almshouses in the early 20th century, segregated by race. One building is now an admired school. Another is an arts center. Children and artists fill rooms that once confined the poor. But the new signage rarely mentions the old purpose. The 2014 radar survey reported 2 clusters of graves separated by a gap that likely marked a former road, an invisible boundary that once divided burial space by race. Even in the ground, segregation persisted. And in that cemetery, only one person has been confidently identified by name. Everyone else is a silhouette in the soil. If you've ever walked through a park and felt the place had a strange quiet, keep reading. Monroe County, New York, contains a park famous for spring flowers and festivals, a place that looks like pure civic pride. Few visitors realize the park was built atop a former almshouse complex that also included an asylum and a penitentiary. Residents from all 3 institutions were buried on the property. Cemetery records weren't just incomplete. They were effectively gone. In the 1980s, routine landscaping exposed human remains, and archaeologists were called in. Over one summer, they exhumed hundreds of bodies, studied them, and reinterred them elsewhere. Even then, the count came with an unsettling footnote. Many more were likely still there, under paths and plantings, because the full burial ground had never been mapped. Among the exhumed remains was a man whose bones told a story the paperwork barely hinted at. His record suggested he died after severe surgery. His skeleton showed amputations with no healing evidence that he died during or immediately after the procedure. In an era when poorhouse residents feared hospitals, that kind of case explains why. If you were poor and sick, medicine could mean experiment, neglect, or a table you never left. And the final indignity wasn't only suffering, it was anonymity. Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania, reveals the machinery behind the erasure. The poorhouse wasn't merely a warehouse for the unwanted. It was also a supplier. The city almshouse complex, known historically as Blockley, had one of the largest potter's fields in the region, later built over by major institutions. For years, cadavers from the grounds were taken for dissection. Administrators acknowledged that the practice terrified residents. Communities, especially black communities, understood that admission could become a one-way trip, not just to death, but to being disassembled for someone else's education. When illegal grave-robbing rings were exposed in the 19th century, the public response wasn't to protect the dead equally. In many states, lawmakers created anatomy acts that legalized the use of unclaimed bodies for medical schools. The logic was framed as public health and science. The reality was a transfer of power, a legal pipeline that routed the bodies of the poor into dissecting rooms. The scandal of theft became policy, and the people least able to refuse paid the price. Middlesex County, Massachusetts. Tewksbury is remembered in popular history because a girl once confined there later became famous as a teacher. The sanitized version of her biography often skips the conditions that shaped her: illness, overcrowding, and the grim routine of institutional life. But the deeper story of Tewksbury isn't only misery. It's allegations of commerce. In the 1880s, state leaders accused the institution of profiting from the dead, sending bodies, including infants, to medical schools in exchange for money. Testimony described frequent deliveries of small corpses for dissection, a supply so steady it sounded like scheduling rather than tragedy. Witnesses suggested some infants bore signs of deprivation. A former resident believed her newborn was killed. A watchman reported being instructed, in essence, to look away. Unless the building is on fire, do not notice too much. If you want a slogan for bureaucratic cruelty, that sentence will do. Cook County, Illinois, shows how enormous the system could become. In the mid-19th century, the county established a sprawling poor farm complex that grew into an infirmary, asylum, and tuberculosis hospital. At its peak, the burial rate was roughly 1,000 people per year. Over decades, estimates reach into the tens of thousands, laid into unmarked graves. The original cells were tiny, with barred windows and iron doors. Winters were brutal. Contemporary descriptions spoke of vermin so pervasive they seemed alive in the walls. And there were crimes beyond neglect. A watchman was convicted of selling bodies, and testimony claimed he even offered to have a living patient killed and sold, betting that staff would assume the person had wandered off. Years later, Construction repeatedly unearthed remains. Bones surfaced in yards. A femur turned up like a bad omen in ordinary soil. The city kept building anyway: stores, homes, schools, layering daily life over mass anonymity. Now pause. Breathe. This part matters, because across these counties, there is a connective thread that isn't sentimental. It's financial. In 1935, the Social Security Act altered incentives. Benefits were paid to individuals, but people living in government-provided institutions were excluded. Counties faced a choice: keep running poor farms without that federal stream reaching residents, or close the institutions and let people receive checks. Many counties closed facilities not because compassion surged, but because accounting shifted, and when the doors shut, the land became available. The cemeteries became inconvenient, and bulldozers became the final archivists. If you're reading this on your phone, here's your social feed moment. Save this. Screenshot it. Send it to someone who thinks history is only monuments. Because a lot of history is parking lots. The hardest thing about researching the poor farm era isn't finding evidence. It's realizing how widespread it was. Census schedules recorded names and conditions. Newspapers ran inspections and exposés. Burial books exist in fragments. The receipts are everywhere. The math is what breaks you. There were thousands of counties. The system ran for more than a century, even if a single institution held only dozens at a time. The churn across generations is staggering. The number of people who lived in these places, died in them, and were buried without markers is not a tidy statistic. It is a population swallowed by administration. If your family tree goes silent in the 19th century, if someone appears in one census and vanishes in the next, consider the possibility that they entered one of these institutions. They may be listed in records under a label that flattened their story into a category. And if they died there, their grave may be under something ordinary. A park trail, a school addition, a highway shoulder, a grocery aisle, a name written once, then paved over. So what do we do with that? We stop treating unknown as the end of the story. We ask counties to survey before they build. We demand that institutions acknowledge what they replaced. We fund identification projects where possible. We teach the history not as trivia but as policy because it was policy. And we remember that the radar keeps finding what it was never meant to find. Not because the dead were cunningly concealed, but because the living decided they weren't worth looking for. If you take anything from this, let it be this. The ground under your city has a memory. Every time a construction crew breaks earth on land that once held a county home, there is a chance they will strike bone. Not because someone hid a secret, but because a society hid its shame in plain sight. And when a country chooses who deserves remembrance, it also tells you who it is willing to erase. The question isn't only how many graves are out there. The question is what it means that we built so much of normal life on top of them and called it progress. Drop a pin on your local map. Search County Home, Alms House, Poor Farm, Potter's Field. If you find one, don't scroll past. Don't notice too little. Notice it on purpose. And if you're thinking, this can't be near me, that reaction is part of how the system survived. These institutions were designed to sit on the edge of town far enough to forget, close enough to exploit. When they closed, the edges became valuable, and forgetting became profitable. A boundary line turned into a subdivision. A burial field turned into open space. A potter's field became a campus. The paperwork thinned. The witnesses died. The grass grew back. You'll see people online argue about whether we should leave the past alone. But the past is not alone. It is under our feet, and it gets disturbed every time we expand a road or lay a foundation. The ethical question is not abstract. It's logistical. Will we budget for surveys? Will we mark the dead? Will we stop treating anonymity as acceptable collateral? Here's the part no algorithm loves. There is no single villain. There are thousands of small decisions. An inspector who writes offensive and moves on. A commissioner who approves a sale. A contractor who hauls soil away. A university that benefits. A newspaper that shrugs. A community that prefers not to know. The cruelty is systemic, then ordinary, then invisible. That is how it scales. So yes, share this if you want, but also do one real-world thing. Attend a county meeting, ask about historic cemeteries, donate to a local preservation group, volunteer for archival transcription, push for signage that tells the truth. Memory is not just a feeling. It's an infrastructure project. The radar doesn't accuse. It merely shows outlines. A rectangle here, a void there. A row that makes no sense until you remember that people were once filed like inventory. When those outlines appear on a survey screen, the present has to negotiate with what it tried to bury. And that negotiation, whether we document, protect, and name, reveals who we are now.